everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn. My name's Kella and Kapnisi. I'm a project manager here at Team, and I have a special interest in usability engineering, particularly for diagnostics. I've worked on various different diagnostic development programs over the years, many with a strong usability engineering element to them, including cancer, point of care diagnostics, several COVID lateral flow tests, at home lateral flow tests, and a range of other things.
Hi, so my name is Natalie Weir. I'm a human factors consultant at Team, and I've been in consulting for over 15 years now. My background is product design engineering, but I focus and have focused over the majority of my career in user-centered design, and usability engineering, feeding in all the user inputs throughout the development process from early staged concept generation through to evaluating user interfaces in the final stages of development.
So today we're going to talk to you about usability engineering in diagnostics, and the key things we hope that you take away from the talk today. Firstly, why you should care about usability engineering, then in more detail what's required from the usability engineering process and what outputs you should expect, how you can comply with 62366 in particular, and then finally how to go about applying that process in practice, particularly for diagnostic devices. So firstly, what is usability engineering? This definition shown here, this is from the FDA, and it quite nicely breaks this definition down into three key parts. Firstly, it's all about understanding the user, the natural human behavior, abilities, limitations, all the things to do with the specific users of your diagnostic. Then it's about applying that knowledge of your users to the design of your user interface of your diagnostic. And the user interface doesn't just mean a graphic user interface. For example, it's anything that the user interfaces with. So this includes buttons, handles, the information for user documentation, any training material, apps, everything. And so once you've understood your users and used that to design your user interface by going through the usability engineering process, ultimately the aim then is to demonstrate that you have developed a safe and effective diagnostic device that's suitable for use by your intended users in the intended use environment. And you'll notice that a couple of terms get thrown around, both human factors engineering and usability engineering. They're very similar and broadly interchangeable. Human factors is typically used more as a term in the US, and usability engineering more so in the UK and in the EU, but they're broadly interchangeable. So why should you care about usability engineering? The first and most important reason is safety. A poorly designed user interface of a diagnostic can, and sadly on many occasions has, led to serious harm and even death for patients and potentially users. So for example, on the right here in the top right corner, the screen, that's an example of a real product, a blood glucose monitor, and the healthcare professionals misinterpreted the poorly designed screen to read 22 rather than 2.2 millimoles per litre. And as a result, they delivered 10 times the treatment dose to patients, putting many of them into diabetic comas, causing hypoglycemia and ultimately death for many of them. And as well as that, it was a very costly mistake for them and led to recalls of the device. And this is just one simplified example. I'm sure you can all think of examples of how sampling for COVID, it can be quite tricky for users to do and lead to errors, use errors, and incorrect diagnosis. And there are many different ways in which use errors can occur with diagnostics and the kinds of harm that can result from that. So safety, number one reason you should care about usability engineering. Secondly, it can also be greatly beneficial to your commercial success by going through the usability engineering process. Even though from a regulatory point of view, the emphasis, of course, is very much on safety, the same process can provide you with a great deal of insight into your users, understanding and therefore addressing potential unmet needs and optimizing the user experience for your users, which ultimately just means you'll make better products and therefore have happier users, customers, and all of this ultimately leads to a better bottom line for you. And it is worth noting here, of course, the topic of the talk today is all about usability and user experience, but we're well aware that this has to be balanced with your commercial goals and technical constraints, and as shown in this Venn diagram here, they sometimes are in conflict with each other, and of course when that occurs, safety is most important, but actually much of the time they can work together. As I said, by improving the user experience, you often will find that that works closely with improving commercial goals, and there are occasions when having this improved understanding can make solving technical constraints easier as well. And then finally, the final reason you should care about usability engineering is because it's the law and you have to. And that's true very much for diagnostics as well as medical devices. The IVDR compared to the IVDD puts much greater emphasis now on usability engineering, in particular peppered throughout the regulation. It calls for proving that your diagnostic is safe and effective for use by the intended users in the intended use environment, and that covers all aspects of the user interface as mentioned earlier. And this is true not just for the IVDR but also FDA, MHRA, and generally globally. What we've seen over the years is a very strong trend towards taking usability engineering much more seriously, and it is certainly something notified bodies will be looking for. So I keep referring to the usability engineering process. So what is the usability engineering process? It looks like this, what I'm showing you here. This is our standard operating procedure here at Team, and it's been developed in line with the regulations. And it starts by planning the usability engineering activities. Makes sense, starting with a plan, and you'll document this in your usability engineering plan. Then the next step is all about defining the intended use and user needs. So this is all about understanding your users, who they are, what their abilities are, their constraints, what the use environment is like for them, and so on. And you define this in the use specification document. Then the bulk of the activities happen here in this iterative usability engineering cycle, and this happens during the majority of the course of your product development process. And this is the usability engineering process is really a risk-based process. It's all about understanding the use-related risks of your device. So this is the first step in this iterative loop, and then mitigating those risks by design, not at the last minute once you've already designed it, but during the course of the development of the device. So that's what this iterative loop is all about. So you will identify risks, you will specify the user interface, and this can be part of your product requirement specification document or a standalone document. The key really is to have defined the requirements of your user interface, and this will be based on the risks that you've identified and also your understanding of your users, which you've defined earlier as well. You use this then to design your user interface and go on to evaluate that user interface in this iterative cycle. And the evaluations you do, these will be firstly formative evaluations, and there's all different types of formative evaluations that you can do, and it's important to tailor the type that you do and the way you go about them to suit your particular product, your particular users, and the different stages of the development program you're in. You can do different types of evaluations when you're in the early concept stages, and this can be tailored to suit as you progress through this iteration to higher fidelity prototypes. Then the final evaluation you'll do in the last round of this loop will be your summative evaluation. And whereas formative evaluations are used to inform the design and feedback into the next iteration of the design, the summative evaluation is your final evaluation, and it's where you prove that you have in fact designed a user interface which is safe and effective for use by the intended users in the intended use environment. And that will be your proof there in the summative evaluation. Then the final step is compiling all of these output documents that you've produced during the process into a usability engineering file, and along with a usability engineering report. And so all of those outputs I've just discussed are shown here in this table, and it shows how they correlate to the different regulatory bodies, the three key ones: 62366 for the EU, FDA guidance, and MHRA. And there are some subtle differences between these regulatory bodies, but the purpose of this table is just to demonstrate that broadly they are very similar, and the usability engineering process that you follow is broadly quite similar. So if you follow this process we've described and execute it well, you're setting yourself up well to be compliant, not just with the EU, but more widely. So that's the usability engineering process. It's really all about understanding your users, using that to mitigate use-related risks by design, and evaluating that, and then justifying and documenting your design decisions as you go. So that's everything I wanted to talk about. I'm going to hand over now to Natalie, who will demonstrate how to apply this usability engineering process in practice.
Thank you, Kella. So I'm now going to talk to you about applying usability engineering to diagnostics. Usability engineering should be applied throughout development, from early opportunity exploration all the way through to commercialization. And here you can see how the different steps in the usability engineering process that Kella just spoke through map onto the different stages of development. There's likely to be multiple iterative loops for the iterative usability engineering activities. So when you're managing risk, specifying, designing, and evaluating the user interface, and that iterative cycle is likely to continue throughout the development until you get to your design verification validation activities. So I'd now like to talk you through a hypothetical brief that we've created for this session, and we'd like to try and describe what a usability engineering program might look like if you were to be developing an at-home diagnostic for chlamydia, for example. So I'm now going to talk through the key usability engineering activities and considerations that apply at the different stages of development for this particular brief when designing a diagnostic for chlamydia. So the orange text on each slide links back to the key usability engineering process stages. So one of the first activities is to determine the appropriate level of usability engineering. So making sure that you develop a usability engineering plan that's aligned with your D&D plan, your design and development plan, and is visible to the whole project team so they understand what the requirements are from a usability engineering perspective. And this can vary hugely depending on the risk profile of the product, depending on your regulatory pathway, and even based on specific program requirements or drivers, so timelines, budgets, for example. Another key activity, a foundational activity, is to understand user needs and define intended use. So this is about all the important characteristics that influence use, so defining users, use environments, use scenarios, and even thinking about training, for example. So in terms of users, it's thinking about how many user groups are there, and a user group is defined based on a group of people sharing similar profiling characteristics, so similar capabilities, similar demographics, attitudes, motivations, skill, for example. And in this particular case, it might just be that there's only a single user group. So it might just be a single group of lay users, general public, who are the patient population, and they might be from 16 plus, and you need to just write down and define the key profiling characteristics for that group of people. We have had feedback, just as a side, from regulatory bodies in the past that sometimes it's appropriate to split that into subgroups based on age-related capability variations. So you might want to think about a subgroup of adolescents, adults and elderly, if appropriate. Not sure how appropriate that is for this application. Also thinking about use environments, so thinking about what are the key environmental characteristics. So in this case, it might be a bathroom, and thinking about what's the humidity, the temperature, poor lighting, for example, and the fact there might be limited surfaces that are available. Also defining what are the key use scenarios that you need to consider throughout your development, and evaluate those scenarios when you are doing your user interface evaluations. So all of this information, all of this understanding that you've obtained, and that might be just understanding that you have already, or you might need to go and do some user research in order to obtain that understanding, but all of that should be captured in a use specification, which is a key document to inform development, guide the design, and also it should align with how you intend to evaluate your user interface. Thinking about your formative and your summative evaluations, and making sure that you are, when you're testing it with intended users and intended use environments, this links back to your use specification. So in terms of iterative usability engineering, so from a managing risk perspective, at this stage, it's really just about identifying any known use problems with similar interfaces. So in this application, it might be thinking of pregnancy tests or fertility tests, and trying to figure out, well, are there any known publicly reported issues that we really need to address with our interface or that apply? In terms of specifying the usability, the user interface, thinking about how you may translate any research that you've got, needs, insights into useful, actionable requirements that are actually helpful and inform design. So not just saying easy to use. That's really difficult to verify. But thinking about what does easy mean for this example. So in chlamydia, for example, a chlamydia diagnostic, you might want to say must be able to correctly interpret result, or must intuitively know how to use it without instruction or guidance. In terms of design and evaluating the user interface, so at this stage, there's not necessarily a user interface that you can evaluate. So you might just be evaluating opportunities or prioritizing user needs, doing online, using online forums or doing some online research just to really help prioritize what's important from a requirement perspective. And just making sure that the team has a very clear, common vision in terms of what's the design intent, making sure that you're all designing the right thing at this early stage. So moving into concept generation, at this stage, it's very much about focusing on the iterative usability engineering activities. So when thinking about managing risk, this is about identifying hazards and use errors and trying to prioritize those and feed those back into the design process. You might use other tools to help identify use errors, perception, cognition, action analysis, for example. Then moving into specifying the user interface. So at this stage, it's thinking about what usability considerations are important. So for this example of a chlamydia diagnostics, a diagnostic, thinking about where does the sample go? Where is the result displayed? What level of feedback is appropriate? How does the user know whether the sample is sufficient or when the result is ready? And it's just trying to make sure you're thinking about the right problems when coming up with your concepts. When designing the user interface, this is about working closely with the designers. So we're big advocates for informing the design. It's not just about evaluating user interfaces in terms of usability engineering. It's really about making sure that you're guiding the design and designing out use errors from the start. So making sure for this example, how can the user only do it the right way? So making sure they know how to insert the sample correctly and it's not possible for them to do it incorrectly. In terms of evaluating the UI, so at this stage, you might start to have some very simple handling models that you could put in front of users. You could start to communicate different concepts and the operating principles of concepts. So you're not going to have representative functional models at this stage where you could do usability assessment as such, but you can still get really useful usability data and identify key usability flaws with very basic handling models. So we would still really value doing user research, exploratory user research at this stage with representative users, so that you can feed that perspective and that user insight back into the concept selection process. And you're still preparing your usability file as you go along. In proof of principle, you need to start planning how you intend to evaluate your user interface. So thinking about your formative and your summative evaluations and justifying the appropriate method. At some point, it's likely that you'll be conducting a usability study in the form of observation of simulated use with intended users, but this doesn't always have to be the case. So it might be appropriate to do a formative evaluation in the form of an expert review. When thinking about your iterative usability engineering activities at this stage of development, so in the risk work stream, it's all about trying to manage and assess your risks throughout the development. So at this stage where you've identified key use related risks, it's making sure that you're assessing, you're prioritizing the key risks, feeding that back into the development activities and working closely with the design team to implement any risk mitigation strategies, and making sure that if there are design changes, you're documenting and assessing whether you're introducing any new risks, thinking about risk mitigation as the design evolves. Also thinking about how effective the risk mitigation strategies are and determining if there's any more risk mitigations that are required in order to ensure that the residual risks are acceptable. In terms of specifying user interface, so it's really about detailing your user interface requirements, making sure that you are capturing in a UI spec if there's any specific risk mitigation strategies that need to be implemented in detailed design. From a design perspective, it's working closely with the designers and the engineers to really help inform and guide the design from the outset. So not retrospectively having to critique and review the user interface. There's often many trade-offs that are made and compromises that all disciplines have to make during a development process, and it's making sure that at the point when decisions are made that you have a use-related risk expert, or that perspective is covered, so a usability engineering champion who's waving the flag and making sure that if there are compromises, that they're not unacceptable compromises that will really be detrimental to the safety of the product. So making sure that the original intent, the design intent in terms of meeting user requirements, or the use-related risk hasn't been compromised, or you still continue to design the right thing. In terms of evaluating the user interface, so at this stage you might have semi-functional prototypes that are fairly representative in terms of their interactions. So you could put those in the hands of real users. So finding representative users doing online diaries, for example. So you send out a kit of parts, kit of prototypes to people, they can interact with them and use them as they would in situ. So you can get some really rich usability data, and you might follow up with an online interview where you can really probe and understand the root cause, so that you can feed back this usability data and improve the interface from a usability perspective to reduce risk and make it a better product. And obviously you're checking that you're thinking about what you need to submit and your UE documentation as you're going along. As you move into detailed design, it's still about managing the risk, so assessing the effectiveness of mitigation strategies and trying to assess residual risks, and then determining whether there's further optimization that might be required. And this is all aspects of the user interface, so this is thinking not just about the device itself, it might be thinking about accompanying materials, the IFU, so instructions for use, any labels or any apps that you might be used alongside. So it's really just trying to think about your risk mitigations. In terms of designing the user interface, continuing to work very closely with the design team to refine the design, detailing specific features and functions. In terms of evaluating the user interface, so this might be formative usability studies, evaluating the usability of the final user interface before you actually get into doing the final summative study. So at this stage, you might be having very specific objectives for a study. So you might not know the answer to specific questions, like what force is appropriate for particular features or functions. So for this particular example, where you've got a chlamydia diagnostic, where it's a really the user group is an easy recruit. So it's easy to access the general population and representative users. So you could, for example, go into a hotel room and do off-street research, where you just recruit people from the street, get them into the hotel room and ask them to interact with particular models that you have that explore particular forces. And then you can feed that back into the design process to say, yes, this force is acceptable, no, this force isn't acceptable, and we need to do something about it. So it's just trying to make sure that you are not just doing studies for study's sake. It's making sure that you are evaluating the usability of the user interface at key development stages, but also doing a study if you really need to answer a question or you don't know what the answer is and you need to have input from users in order to define the design direction. Okay, so moving on. So moving into design verification and the validation stage of development. At this stage, it's about evaluating your final user interface and demonstrating that your final user interface is safe and effective in the hands of intended users. So this would typically be done in the form of a usability study, a summative usability study. And for this particular example, where we're thinking about a chlamydia diagnostic, this might be a single user group of 15 patients, which is consistent with what we outlined in our use specification. And the 15 patients, that is based on this recommendation from multiple regulatory bodies that you should have 15 participants per distinct user group in a usability test for summative evaluations. That's to make sure that you identify all the key usability issues that might exist with that user interface. So we'd have our sample and we would ask them to simulate use, going through the key use scenarios that were identified and outlined in your use specification, and making sure that the use environment is representative where appropriate. So you then need to make sure that you have the evidence and the justification for why your device or your interface is safe and effective. And if there are any residual risks, you need to provide the necessary root cause analysis so that you can justify whether those are acceptable risks. And you may have the necessary risk-benefit analysis to help your case, and you need to make sure that that is all documented in your risk management report or in your usability engineering summary report, where you are documenting your usability engineering process that you applied for this project, and you are justifying why your device is safe and effective. So moving into the final stage of development, commercialization, there is still a responsibility for manufacturers to conduct usability engineering activities in the form of post-market surveillance. So this is about monitoring customer complaints and making sure that if there are any known or publicly reported use-related risks or usability issues that have been identified with your product, these need to be fed back into the risk management process, and you may need to do some further optimization. So hopefully this gives you a better feel for how you can apply usability engineering as part of a development process for this particular application, which is a diagnostic for chlamydia. So I'd now like to wrap up today's session and summarise the key usability engineering points that we'd like you to take away from today. So applying usability engineering ensures safer and more effective products. It's an iterative process. It's not just about evaluating the user interface, it's really about being an active participant in the design process and informing the design direction. Applying usability engineering early results in more effective risk mitigation, so you can design out use issues from the start, from the outset, and this typically will save money and time. It doesn't happen by accident. It requires ownership, and it requires independent champion to wave the usability engineering flag throughout the development process to make sure you're involved in key design decisions. It's a regulatory requirement, and it's about justifying and documenting the interface decisions, the design decisions that were made or weren't made, and providing justification for why you didn't go a particular route. And the introduction of IVDR means that you must apply usability engineering, but one size does not fit all. So not every program is the same, and you need to determine what's appropriate for your program. And our final slide is a quote that I personally really like. So a user interface is like a joke. If you have to explain it, it's not that good.
We've had a few questions coming in. The first one, someone asked, how would you go about looking at use areas of a competitor's product?
I can jump in on this one. So I think looking at competitor products is a really useful input into the use risk assessment that you're going to do as part of this usability engineering process. So the obvious way of identifying risks that people think of is sitting in a room and discussing ways that users can make errors, but actually looking at existing products is another great way of identifying potential risks if there are similar potential hazards for yours. In particular, I like using the databases that are available, like the FDA has a database where you can search existing products that are on the market and problems that have occurred with them. They're recorded for you to look at, and that's a really great input for risk assessments.
So we've had another question. Is the line between monitoring health apps and medical device diagnostics shifting?
Yes, so I think it is. I mean, I think this is something that is very topical. Lots of people are talking about, and there's a wealth of opinion and experience in this area at Team. So I think we can come back to you and give you a more detailed answer on that one. But yeah, I think there is this big overlap, and I think it's a challenging area for us to think about, and we all just have to make sure that we're applying the right principles from the start. So I think regardless of what it is that you're designing, you still need to apply a good usability engineering process. So I think this all applies. I think there is this grey blurred boundary at the moment between digital health, and I think it's kind of watching this space really at the moment.
So thanks for that. So we've got another question. Could one of you tell us your views on usability versus functionality of a collection blood kit test?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but I think it's in terms of a blood sampling product is, I assume, what the question is. And I assume it's just trying to make sure then that you're thinking about, well, can people do that correctly? So it really depends on who the user is, making sure that you've understood what their capabilities are, what their skill set is, trying to make sure that you've then thought about what the applicable use errors are that they might be making, and trying to figure out what's appropriate for that specific user group. In terms of how you might assess and evaluate that can obviously be quite challenging when you're thinking about particular applications, but I think there are ways where you can just make sure that you're obtaining rich data and you are thinking of what is achievable. So it might be appropriate to isolate out the blood component, for example, if you are, well, you can't obviously be doing clinical studies, but it's just trying to make sure that you're thinking about it is really what are the capabilities of your user and what can they achieve. And sorry, I'm not quite sure, because I'm not quite sure how specific to be. Kella, I don't know if you've got anything to add.
Yeah, I think on the only thing I was thinking on the usability versus functionality part of that question, I think almost is the wrong way of framing it. I think for something like a sampling device or blood collection device, the usability is a large part of the functionality. If the user can't use it to collect their blood, there's no function there either. So it's appreciating that the usability of the device for your particular user type, as Natalie said, is such a fundamental part of how it functions. They need to be thought about together. You know, it can't function without having usability, and it won't. So think of them together really, and address them together.
Excellent. So we've had one more question just come in. Someone's asked, how can usability engineering be applied for a product post-launch when it's on the market?
Yes, I was expecting this question. So I'm assuming in particular people are thinking of the advent of IVDR for products that are currently on the market under IVDD. So we've talked all the way through the process and in detail on how you can apply this in detail for new product development. The onus of considering usability engineering still applies to products that are on the market as you're now going through IVDR. But remember, this is a risk-based process standard. So it's all about tailoring the process to your specific product and in particular the risks of that product. So if it's something that's already on the market, you have lots of data to demonstrate usability, then and this is still unclear because it's still in the early days of people actually going through regulatory bodies with IVDR, but the current consensus is that you can potentially get away with a root cause analysis, but that relies on you obtaining good data from real world users using your products and you need to then document your understanding of that in terms of root cause and apply the standard risk management type thinking to identify the level of risk those potential use errors pose and what level of mitigation is required and risk benefit analysis, all of that. But it can potentially be a desk-based exercise if you've got the right real world data to use for that.
Yeah, and I kind of echo everything that Kella said, and I think it's just trying to make sure that if you have identified any risks that you think are unacceptable, then it's just trying to make sure you identify the appropriate strategies to mitigate those risks. So obviously it might not be possible to go all the way back and design those out. And if you can provide sufficient justification that it can be mitigated in other ways, then that's acceptable depending on your justification and the risk profile of those risks that have been identified. But we would stress, as we've hopefully communicated in this presentation, that the most effective way typically to design out use errors and mitigate risk is by thinking about it early and really designing it out from the start. So that's where it's not normally optimal to retrospectively apply usability engineering. It's much more challenging. It's not impossible, and it can be appropriate in some cases, but as Kella said, it really does depend on your risk profile.